If you've been following this study of Esther, we've said that this whole book is a great example of how God works in everyday life, because God works in everyday life without miracles. And we see that really demonstrated at the closing of Esther's story, the last 6 chapters of the book. We see how God works in powerful ways, but in ways that are not miraculous. So let's turn back to the story. Esther is accepted by the king. As we said, Esther was risking her life by going before the king because if he did not hold out his scepter to her, she'd be executed. And so she asks the Jewish people and Mordecai to fast, to pray for 3 days. And after that time, she goes before the king, and here's what happens. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. So we see that Esther has found favor with Xerxes. He's not going to kill her. In fact, he says, Esther, what do you want? I'll do whatever you want for you. What do you want? And she says, here's what I want, king. I want you and Haman, remember he's the villain, I want you and Haman to come to a banquet I'm going to throw today. And so the king and Haman, they come to this banquet, and the king's there, and he's having a good time. And he says, now seriously, honey, seriously, wife, why did you come before me? Because he knew it wasn't just for a banquet. It was too special of a thing for her to just do that, just for a banquet. And she doesn't tell him what her real plans are at this time. She still says, well, come back tomorrow. I want you to come back tomorrow, you and Haman, and I'm going to throw you another banquet. And so after this, Haman is feeling good about himself. He's been invited to a banquet that the queen threw for him, and she's going to invite him to another banquet the next day. He's feeling great about himself, but he sees Mordecai. And Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refuses to bow down to Haman. And Haman is angry about this, and he tells his wife about this, and she says, you should kill this Mordecai. And so Haman decides he's going to build a 75-foot pole, and he's going to use that to impale Mordecai. Don't you love just sort of the intrigue and the action of the Old Testament? And so that's their plan. Well, the story continues, and something interesting happens, kind of a turning point for this whole Esther story. God gives the king a sleepless night. We are told that the night between the two banquets, the king couldn't sleep, and that might seem like an unimportant detail, but something important happens. Take a look. That night, the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. Now, it says in the Bible that the king had trouble sleeping, but what you and I are supposed to understand is that this whole story is helping us understand God's providence, how God works through everyday things. And so we're supposed to understand that God's the one who's making it so that Xerxes can't sleep. And so he gets one of his servants and he says, please read to me the history of my reign. And as the history of his reign is being read to him, he learns about this incident when Mordecai saved his life. You might remember from the first lesson, we said that Mordecai saved the king's life by exposing this assassination plot. And so the king says, was Mordecai ever celebrated for this? And no, he hadn't. And so he says, okay, tomorrow, right away, we are going to throw a big celebration for Mordecai. And he gets Haman, and he puts Haman in charge of this big celebration for Mordecai. So you have this hilarious picture of Mordecai on a horse in royal robes getting praised by everyone, and Haman is having to lead him. It's very embarrassing, very comical story. It's very embarrassing for Haman, who hates Mordecai and wants to kill him. So you have that little reversal where the king now is beginning to trust, or certainly trusts Mordecai, the Jew. Well, let's see what happens as the story wraps up. Esther reveals Haman's true character. At the second banquet, the king's there, Haman's there. Esther decides this is the moment to tell Xerxes that I am a Jew. And so she does. She says, I am a Jew, and I am going to be killed, and all of my people are going to be killed. And when the king realizes that Esther's a Jew and her life's in danger, he's enraged, and he walks out. And there's Haman, and Haman understands, I'm in big trouble here, because this is my plot, and now my plot is going to get Mordecai killed, whom the king loves, and now it's going to get Esther killed, who's his queen. And so Haman begs to be saved, begs for Esther to speak up on his behalf, and the king comes in, and it looks to him that Haman's attacking Esther, and so right away, he has Haman arrested and impaled on the very same pole that he was going to use to impale Mordecai. Kind of a bloody little mess. And so Haman, the villain, is done away with. And then Mordecai and Esther, since they're now both known to the king as Jews, they tell the king, our people are going to be killed. We need you to make a new law that will protect the Jewish people. And so the king says, okay, do whatever you need to protect yourselves. And so what happens, because the king's original law that on a certain day the Jewish people would be killed, that can't be undone. And so what the king does is he allows Mordecai and Esther to write a law that says that the Jewish people on this date can protect themselves, they can organize, they can get weapons, they can get an army together, and they have the full authority and protection of the government behind them, and they can defend themselves. And that's the law. It goes out to all the Jewish people, and we find that when the day comes, when the enemies of the Jews were going to kill the Jews, the tables are turned. Another turning point in the story. The tables are turned, and the Jews are ready. They're an army. They've got the weapons that the government allowed them to have, and they destroy their enemies. And God has delivered the Jewish people. That's what happens. That's the big event of the Esther story. Not that she becomes queen, not even that she goes before the king, but God saves his people one more time, and he does this through non-miraculous events. Now, what does this mean for you and I? God works in your life through the ordinary. Now, the events of this story might seem pretty extraordinary, but nothing miraculous happens. These are just the lives of regular people who did some extraordinary things for God. And God worked in their lives. And this shows us how God works in our lives, how he uses the decisions of humans and the choices of humans to accomplish his purpose in the world. In fact, we see this in the life of Jesus. In Acts chapter 3, 17 through 18, the Apostle Peter's preaching, and he says, God used the actions of evil people to bring about the greatest good, the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection from the dead that saved you and I from our sins. And so God really does use every event of our lives for good. Even those events that seem evil, even those events that are evil, that evil people do to us, those sinful choices that we make or our friends make, God uses all of those things for good. He works extraordinarily through very ordinary means. This is called God's providence. God's providence refers to the everyday way in which God runs things, the everyday way in which God keeps the universe humming and things going, and how he works through seemingly normal circumstances to accomplish his will in the world. And as you think about your life, I want you to think about some of these turning points of your life. Think about some of the small decisions that you made in your life. Maybe it was a decision, maybe it was a decision to get a certain kind of job, or maybe it was kind of deciding on the school you would go to, the college you'd go to, or maybe even the certain class that you took where you met your best friend or you met your spouse, or maybe it was just on a whim going to church one Sunday and learning about Jesus. These things that happen in our lives, they feel like accidents. They seem like, man, I could have just as easily not gone to church on that Sunday. But all of these things, I believe, have been ordained by God. They are part of God's providence that he has put into our lives to help shape our lives so that we would encounter him and we'd experience his plans and his purposes for our lives. And so understand that God is in your life. God is active. God is doing things. And maybe he doesn't talk to you in dreams and visions, and certainly you don't see miracles every day. But what you do experience every day is the providence of God leading you, just like he led Mordecai and just like he led Esther.